Hello, welcome to this webinar on how to build a balanced scorecard. My name is Matt Evans and I'll be the instructor during this webinar, which is approximately 1 hour in duration. And basically what I want to do in this 1 hour is to give you specific steps that you can take to build the balanced scorecard from beginning to end. I want to go through the nuts and the bolts, the very specific steps, techniques that you need to apply to construct a really good balanced scorecard. And I'll even include some tools and templates at the end of the webinar to make sure that you are empowered with everything you need to do and know to make the balanced scorecard a success within your company. So let me talk a little bit about myself before we get into the balanced scorecard. I've got about 30 years of experience. I graduated from LSU in 1980. And I worked my way up from like an accountant, an analyst, and then an auditor, and then finance manager, controller. I've worked in all three sectors of the economy, both public companies, private companies. I live and work in the Washington, D.C. area, so I've done some work with government agencies as well, including nonprofits. I'm also a big believer in continuing professional education, so I make a strong commitment to keep my skill level very high. I have 3 professional certifications. I'm a certified public accountant, certified management accountant, and certified in financial management. And I've gone through the Wharton Business School, J.L. Kellogg Graduate School of Management, Six Sigma Green Belt, Villanova University for Business Intelligence. I'm a certified business analyst on IT projects here in Washington, D.C. So I have a very broad range of professional development and education, as well as of experience. And for the balanced scorecard, I was kind of like an early adopter of the balanced scorecard when Harvard Business School released it. I was formally trained by Harvard Business School when the balanced scorecard first came out, and I've led certain balanced scorecard projects throughout my career. The most recent one was a major one at the U.S. Army here in Washington, D.C., where I work and live, where I worked with a lot of consultants for a major balanced scorecard system that included formal training. I had to help develop a strategic planning model and things like that, and we'll talk about that toward the end of the webinar. And over the last 10 years, I've worked as an independent consultant and project manager, and I primarily work with private companies that are kind of what I call the mid-market space, which is about 10 to 50 to maybe as large as $100 million in annual sales revenues. And these companies are throughout the United States. Even though I live and work in Washington, D.C., I deal with companies in Texas, North Carolina, all over the country. And my sweet spot is performance measurement systems. And that can be logic models, not just balanced scorecards, because I deal with nonprofits as well. So let's talk about how we're going to go through this webinar today with you. There's 3 sections that I want to go through. And the first section is the what and the why. I want to make sure you understand what exactly is the balanced scorecard and why should I actually go out and build a balanced scorecard. So I want to get past that first section. And then the most of the webinar, the bulk of the webinar, is the how-to. I want to go through nuts and bolts, specific steps, techniques. I want to show you exactly how to build a balanced scorecard. The maps, the metrics, everything, every little nut and bolt. You're going to know exactly how to build a balanced scorecard. And then at the end, the tools section, I'm going to give you 3 artifacts to make sure that you know exactly how not only to build the balanced scorecard, but I'll give you a strategic planning model that we developed here in Washington, D.C. that I think you'll find useful, that dovetails really well into the scorecard. So you're not going to have any excuse for not building a balanced scorecard after this webinar. So that's really what I want you to kind of get away out of this webinar. So with that said, let's talk about the first section. I want to make sure you understand the what and the why when it comes to how to build a balanced scorecard. So let's go through section 1. And so what exactly, is a balanced scorecard? Just to make sure you understand what exactly is it. The balanced scorecard really represents a framework that enables you to execute your strategy, because the reality is, if I walk around your company and I talk to people and I ask them, what is the strategy of the company? You know what you're going to find out? Most people don't know. They don't know. Well, I think it's this, I'm not sure. So even though you may have some goals and you communicate those goals, doesn't mean people throughout the company understand what they are. So what you've got to do is you've got to drill down to a lower level of objectives, metrics, and targets to get down to where execution takes place. And that's going to enable execution. That's what people understand, not the goals and the mission of the company, but what are my objectives, what are my metrics and targets that I've got to do on my job to make execution happen within the company. So the thing is, when you do that, you're going to communicate strategy in terms that people can understand. They can wrap their arms around it. So it's fine to have a goal and say, our goal is to improve customer service. But okay, well, for the people throughout the company, how are you going to do that? You got to be a lot more specific. You have to have a lot more granularity to it. So let's take it to an objective. The objective is to improve call center wait times. We want to reduce call center wait times by 30% over the next 9 months. That is very specific. That makes sense to people. Now they know exactly what they've got to execute on. And that's what we want to do. That's part of the process of building the balanced scorecard, is to get down to measurable terms, quantify the strategy. The second thing, or the main thing that I would also say is, it's, and I admit I'm guilty of this as a CPA, is I'm sometimes too addicted to financial metrics. And there's a problem with that. The financial metrics are the ultimate outcome that we want to achieve. That's fine to look at that. But you've got to drill down to the underlying drivers of financial performance. Great customer service, motivated people working for the company, efficient systems and processes, a great product. Those are the enablers, right? That enable the outcome of financial results. So we need a balance, a mix of different measurements so that we're not just reactive by looking at financial metrics, but we're proactive by looking at the underlying non-financial drivers of the model, the business model. So that's going to help us manage the business in a much more proactive way. And that leads me to my fourth point, which is, sometimes when you walk into a company, not only do people not understand the strategy, but you may have people conflicting with other people in the company. I mean, the marketing people are marching off in their direction. The engineering people are doing something different. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. So you've got to get everybody kind of marching in the same overall direction so you can execute the strategy. Otherwise, you have conflicting forces. So one of the beauties of the Balanced Scorecard is it binds everybody together around one common framework, which reduces all of these divergent forces, and that's going to help you execute your strategy. So that's what the Balanced Scorecard is about, and that's really some of the big benefits of doing the Balanced Scorecard. So that kind of dovetails into, why do I got to do the Balanced Scorecard? Because you want to execute the strategy. That's what this is all about. Now, there's some additional descriptive information. If you go back to the Kaplan and Norton, Robert Kaplan and David Norton, they introduced the Balanced Scorecard way back in 1992. And by the way, it's used by over 70% of the Fortune 1000 companies. And I think today that may even be higher. It's very, very commonly used as the management system. It is the management system for measuring performance. And by the way, I sometimes use a saying here. If you want to manage something, you've got to measure it, right? To manage, you must measure. And if you measure something, you need a measurement or system. The Balanced Scorecard really provides that framework or platform so that you can do that. The actual formal definition of the Balanced Scorecard was released in a book on strategy maps that Kaplan and Norton wrote, and I kind of like it. And it says basically the Balanced Scorecard tells you the knowledge, the skills, the systems that your employees will need, which we'll call the learning and growth perspective, to innovate and build the right strategic capabilities and efficiencies, which we'll call the internal process perspective, that delivers the value to the marketplace, which is the customer perspective, which ultimately leads to higher shareholder value and the financial outcome at the top of the model. So learning and growth is at the bottom of the scorecard model. It enables the outcome above it, which is internal processes that are highly efficient. Once I have those very efficient, capable processes in place, that enables customers, which in turn enables financial results. So there's a cause-effect relationship between the underlying drivers of the scorecard and those financial results at the top of the model, which is the ultimate outcome. So that's something you need to really understand, and we'll harp on that later when we get into how to build the balanced scorecard. So just to reiterate why to use the balanced scorecard, they did, Harvard Business School did case studies, and they document and they quantified through case studies 4 specific barriers that people run into when they run a company and try to execute their strategy. One of which is the vision. The reality is most people are not going to understand what your vision is. If I walk through your company, this is what they quantified. They quantified that less than 10% of your company, if I walk through your company, I'll be lucky if 10% of the people in the company know what the vision, the overall strategy of the company is. Okay, so the reality is most people are not going to understand your strategy. Okay, that's just reality. Then you have a people barrier because people have incentives, and if you want to change behavior for people, you hit their paycheck. I mean, that's one of the ways you hit and change behavior. And if you link performance to something that has nothing to do with strategic execution, then you're going to have a hard time executing your strategy. So that's one of the other barriers they found, is that people oftentimes, their incentives are not linked at all to strategic execution. That causes a real problem. Third thing is resources. A lot of times you allocate resources to things that don't really have strategic impact. So later on in the webinar, I'm going to show you this test that I use. It's a simple grid, simple test to evaluate whether you're allocating your resources for highest strategic impact. Because, the reality is you're doing a lot of things that have very minimal strategic impact, and you don't even realize it. Okay, so I'm going to show you a tool that I use as a consultant here on my balanced scorecard projects. And finally, the management barriers is the truth is, managers, a lot of times, they're dealing with tactics and operations. They're not strategically focused. I mean, in fact, what they found at Harvard Business School is that over 80% of people at the executive, not lower level, executive level, high level, 80% of them spend less than an hour a month going through and reviewing the strategy. How well are we executing on our strategy? Well, the reality is most people don't spend time on it. So the balanced scorecard is going to force people to focus on executing the strategy, whereas most of them are just focused on day-to-day operations, okay? So that's the big 4 barriers. So I want to go through the steps. So what we're going to do in the webinar in the how-to section is we're going to cover steps to build a balanced scorecard. The first step, the first watershed event in the process is to map the strategy, and that's going to take into account at least 4 or 5 what we call perspectives or dimensions of performance of a company. And it's very typical in most scorecards to see financial, customer, process, learning and growth are 4 rather common perspectives or dimensions of performance that will show up on the strategy map. It's not by any means you can do whatever you think needs to fit. In the nonprofit sector, we have resources at the bottom because they need money to do everything. So it varies between the industries, the companies, the sectors that you're dealing with. And we want to quantify it. Once I get the strategy map done, then I got to get down to something that's quantifiable. So we got to deal with metrics and targets and things like that. That's what we want to do. We want to extend the strategy map into quantifiable terms. That's step 2. Then once I've got that strategy map set, once I check the box on step number 2, then I can start to push that thing down align it to lower levels, and just kind of rinse and repeat the process again. Rinse and repeat, right? Just keep building more strategy maps, and what's going to happen is I'm starting to build the overall framework for the whole company, and that's what I want to do. And then once I get down to that, everybody's got to be assigned to actually execute on what's in the framework, and that's going to probably take the form of projects. Because without a project, you're not really closing the loop on the framework. So don't just go out there and create a scorecard and say, well, we got the scorecard and the management system in place. You've got to have action plans, projects, specific things that people have to go out there and do and hold them accountable for executing the strategy. And then once you've got all the projects, you should actually go out, deploy the scorecard, and use it. That's what it's for. So once you get past the projects and you've closed the loop on the framework, now you've got to go out there and do it. Now people have to execute on it, and you've got to monitor it and manage it through the Balanced Scorecard system. That's when you deploy it. So that completes section 1, and now we'll go to section 2.